Billionaire lady invited her poor driver as a joke. But when he arrived, everyone was stunned. The ballroom glittered with crystal lights and expensive laughter. Champagne glasses clinked. Diamonds flashed. And the most powerful people in the city stood waiting for the arrival of one woman. Billionaire business magnate Victoria Hawthorne. She was famous for many things. Her ruthless business deals. Her luxury empire. Her ability to turn enemies into dust with nothing more than a phone call and a cold smile. But tonight, she was famous for something else. Cruel entertainment. Earlier that afternoon, Victoria had done something that made her closest friends laugh until their eyes watered. She had invited her driver to the most exclusive party of the year. Not out of kindness. Not out of respect. Not out of any warm impulse toward the man who had served her faithfully for nearly 3 years. But as a joke. A poor driver, surrounded by billionaires. Her guests couldn't stop laughing. They were already picturing the look on his face. The awkward shuffling. The wide eyes drinking in a world he didn't belong to. The quiet, humiliating reminder of exactly where a man like him stood in the order of things. They thought it was going to be the most entertaining moment of the evening. Until the doors opened. And the driver stepped inside. Because the second they saw him, the entire room went silent. Some people dropped their glasses. Others stood frozen mid-sentence, mouths slightly open, words dying before they could form. Victoria herself turned pale. Because the man she had invited to humiliate was not who she thought he was. Not even close. And by the end of that night, her life would change forever. And nothing in that ballroom, not the chandeliers, not the champagne, not the power and the money and the carefully built reputations, would ever feel quite the same again. Who was this mysterious driver? Why did his arrival cause some of the most powerful, unshakable people in the country to go completely still? And how did a man that everyone in that building believed was simply a working-class driver, hold a secret powerful enough to shake Victoria's entire empire to its foundation? Tonight's story is not just about wealth. It is about pride. About hidden identities. About the dangerous assumptions we make every single day about the people standing quietly in our orbit. And it is about a truth that reminds us of something we forget far too easily. That sometimes, the quietest person in the room is carrying the most powerful story. Stay with us. Because what happened inside that ballroom is far more shocking, far more emotional, and far more human than anything you could be imagining right now. And before we go any further, I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever looked at someone, a driver, a janitor, a man sweeping a parking lot or bagging groceries, and quietly made up your mind about who they were? About how much their life was worth? About what they could possibly know or have or feel that you didn't already know better? Because if you have, this story was made for you. And if you haven't, keep watching. Because by the end of tonight, you'll be glad you did. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. US, UK, Canada, Australia amongst others. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click on the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one come out regularly and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Victoria Hawthorne was the kind of woman that magazines love to put on their covers. Elegant. Sharp-minded. Relentlessly driven. And unbelievably rich. By the age of 58, she had built $1 billion real estate empire that stretched across the country. Luxury hotels in Miami and Chicago. High-rise towers in Manhattan. Private resort properties along coastlines that most Americans only ever see in screensavers. Her name was on buildings. Her face was on magazine covers. Her story, the Ohio girl who clawed her way to the top with nothing but a scholarship and a will that would not bend, was the kind of story that motivational speakers loved to borrow. And Victoria knew it. She wore her success like a second skin. Polished. Fitted. Impossible to ignore. But the people who worked for her every single day, the assistants who answered her calls before 7 in the morning, the security guards who held open the lobby doors, the housekeeping staff who prepared her penthouse suite, the cleaning crews who made her conference room spotless before she arrived, those people knew a completely different side of Victoria Hawthorne. A side that no magazine had ever published. Because Victoria believed in something above all else. Power. And to Victoria, power meant distance. Employees were not friends. They were not people she needed to know. They were tools. Instruments. And instruments did not need names. They needed to function. She rarely used first names. She rarely said thank you. Not because she was a monster, but because somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself that warmth was weakness. That knowing the name of the woman who cleaned her office was the first step toward losing the respect of the people who ran her buildings. She had watched her business mentor, a brilliant man she had admired deeply in her 20s, lose control of 3 separate companies because he got too familiar with his staff. Blurred the lines. Became a friend when he needed to be a boss. Victoria was not going to make that mistake. So she built walls. Tall, efficient, impenetrable walls. And behind those walls, she ran a machine. And machines don't need to be loved. They just need to run. The people in her orbit didn't complain out loud. Working for Victoria Hawthorne looked impressive on a resume. It opened doors. So they stayed. They smiled in meetings and said yes ma'am in the hallways. But in the break rooms, in the parking garages, in the quiet corners of her office towers when the day finally ended, they talked. Not with hatred. But with the kind of hollow exhaustion that settles into a person who has been invisible for too long. Who has poured years of their life into a place and a person who cannot be bothered to learn their name. One of those invisible people was her driver. A quiet, steady man named Samuel Carter. 54 years old. Average build. Salt and pepper hair that was almost always hidden beneath a dark driver's cap. He had been driving Victoria for nearly 3 years. And in 3 years, his routine had never once varied. Every single morning, without fail, he arrived before sunrise. His uniform was always pressed with military precision. His black sedan was always washed and gleaming, no matter the weather the night before. His voice, on the rare occasions he used it, was always calm. Measured. He spoke only when spoken to. He was almost never spoken to. Victoria would slide into the back seat, pull out her phone, and her day would begin. Samuel would pull into traffic. That was the entirety of their relationship. 3 years. Thousands of mornings. Hundreds of hours in the same car. And Victoria had never once asked him about his life. Not his family. Not where he lived. Not why a man his age was driving a car for a living. Not even his full name, which she only knew because it appeared in the payroll paperwork that her assistant handled. But here is the thing about Samuel Carter that Victoria never took the time to notice. He observed everything. From behind that steering wheel, with his eyes steady on the road and his expression giving nothing away, Samuel had seen more of Victoria's real life than almost anyone on earth. He had heard her conduct billion-dollar negotiations on speakerphone, her voice hard and precise as a blade. He had heard her reduce a junior executive to tears during a 10-minute phone call on the way to the airport, then hang up and calmly ask Samuel to turn up the heat. He had been in the car the afternoon she dismissed a loyal assistant of 12 years with a single text message. He had watched her type it in the rearview mirror, her face showing no more emotion than if she were ordering lunch. He had heard her laugh at a competitor's bankruptcy like it was the punchline to a joke she'd been waiting years to hear. He had seen the worst of her. But Samuel had also seen something else. Something small and private that Victoria had never shared with anyone. He had been behind the wheel the evening she made him pull over on Fifth Avenue, in the rain, so she could roll down her window and quietly hand $300 in cash to a homeless veteran sitting on the curb with a cardboard sign. She hadn't announced it. She hadn't looked around to see if anyone was watching. She had done it and then looked out the other window in silence as Samuel pulled back into traffic, as if it had never happened. No one knew about that moment. Except Samuel. He filed it away carefully. Because Samuel filed everything away. He noticed every detail about the people around him. Their patterns. Their contradictions. Their moments of grace hidden beneath their armor. He was, in every sense of the word, watching. But Victoria never watched him back. To her, Samuel was background. He was furniture. He was part of the car the same way the leather seats were part of the car. Present. Functional. Invisible. And utterly unknown. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that Samuel Carter was carrying a secret that would have stopped her cold if she had known it from day one. A secret rooted in a past so far removed from the image of the quiet driver in the front seat that it almost defied belief. A history powerful enough to rewrite everything Victoria thought she understood about the world she had built. And about herself. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. The idea started as a joke. That is the most important thing to understand about how this evening began. No great cruelty announces itself as cruelty. It arrives dressed as entertainment. It arrives with laughter. It arrives on a cold December evening in the back of a limousine, between four people who have had too much champagne and too little humility. Victoria and her three closest friends, Charles Brennan, a hedge fund manager whose reputation for hostile acquisitions had made him deeply wealthy and widely feared, Diane Weston, who ran one of the most influential fashion houses in the country and who had not said a kind word about a competitor in 15 years, and Robert Hale, a venture capitalist who had appeared on the Forbes Billionaire list for 11 consecutive years and who wore that fact the way other men wore expensive watches. Were sitting in the back of Victoria's limousine after a charity gala. They had just spent 3 hours in a 5-star hotel smiling for cameras, writing checks they would claim as tax deductions, and congratulating each other on their generosity. Now, with their ties loosened and their shoes kicked off and the city sliding past outside the tinted windows, the real conversation had begun. They were laughing about the evening. About a city councilman who had committed the unforgivable sin of wearing the wrong cut of suit. About how a tech founder's wife had arrived in a designer collection that was, apparently, 2 seasons old. Small observations. Petty and precise. The kind of conversation that feels like sport when you are inside it and sounds unbearable when you are not. And then Charles said something that shifted the mood in the car. He gestured, casually, lazily, toward the front of the limousine. Toward Samuel, who sat perfectly still behind the wheel, eyes on the road, expression giving away nothing. Charles lowered his voice to what he believed was a whisper. "Do you ever think people like him wonder what it's like on the other side?" Victoria looked up from her champagne. Her eyes moved to the rearview mirror. Samuel's gaze stayed fixed on the road ahead. If he had heard, he gave nothing away. Not a flicker. Not a twitch. He wouldn't understand it even if he saw it, Diane said, swirling her glass. And then something shifted behind Victoria's eyes. A slow, sharp spark. The look she got when an idea arrived. "What if we let him see it?" she said. The car went quiet. Then Charles laughed, a single sharp note of disbelief. "Your driver? At the winter gala?" Victoria smiled. That slow, composed smile that people in her world had learned to be cautious of. "Yes. Think about it. Imagine him walking into that ballroom. Imagine his face when he realizes what real wealth actually looks like." Robert shook his head, grinning despite himself. "Victoria, that is either the most generous impulse you have ever had or the single most wicked thing I have ever heard. Why can't it be both?" she said. And they laughed. All four of them. A warm, private, expensive laugh shared between people who had forgotten or perhaps never knew what it felt like to be the person being laughed at. And that laugh, that bright, careless, champagne-soaked laugh in the back of a moving limousine, was the beginning of everything that followed. Because it set something in motion that none of them were prepared for. Not Charles. Not Diane. Not Robert. And certainly not Victoria. The next morning, Samuel arrived at precisely 7:15, the way he always did. He opened Victoria's door. She slid in. He closed it softly. Pulled into traffic. For the first few minutes, as always, there was silence. Victoria's phone was already out, already lit. Then, without looking up, without ceremony, she said it. "Samuel, I'm hosting the Hawthorne Winter Gala tomorrow evening. Meridian Grand. 8 o'clock. Samuel's eyes moved briefly to the rearview mirror. "Yes, ma'am. I'll have the car ready at 7:30. Victoria paused. Then, "No. I mean, I want you to come. As a guest." A longer pause this time. "As a guest, ma'am?" "Yes. Consider it a Christmas bonus. An experience. Come and see how these evenings work. Another pause. Quiet. Still. Then Samuel gave a single small nod and said, simply, "If you insist, ma'am." And Victoria smiled at her phone and said nothing more. She thought the conversation was complete. She thought she knew exactly how the rest of the story would go. She had written it already in her head. The humble driver in his best department store clothes, eyes wide in the chandelier light, shuffling among people who owned the world. She thought she was the author of that evening. She was wrong. Because Samuel, eyes back on the road, expression unchanged, felt something move quietly behind his chest when she spoke those words. Not surprise. Not nervousness. Not excitement. Something older than all of that. Something that felt, if anything, like a long-delayed reckoning finally beginning to arrive. Before we go any further, I need to stop here for just a moment. Because I want to know how many of you are feeling what this story is already doing. If you are locked in right now, if you can already feel where this is going, type "I'm still watching" in the comments below. Let's see who is truly paying attention. Because honestly, think about Samuel in that car for a second. Think about sitting in the front seat, day after day, year after year, hearing everything, seeing everything, being treated as though you are part of the upholstery. And then being invited, as a joke, to the biggest party of the year. Most people would have been angry. Most people would have said no. Most people would have spent that night stewing. What does it say about a person that Samuel Carter's response was simply, "If you insist, ma'am"? Keep watching. Because the answer to that question is what this entire story is really about. The Hawthorne Winter Gala was, by every available measure, extraordinary. The Meridian Grand Ballroom had been transformed over the course of 3 days by an event design team that charged more per hour than most people earned in a week. Crystal chandeliers threw warm gold light across a space dressed entirely in white and silver. Long tables were covered in imported Belgian linen. The centerpieces were white orchids, flown in fresh that morning from a grower in Thailand. In the far corner, a 12-piece live orchestra filled the room with music that was soft enough to allow conversation but present enough to remind every person in attendance that this was not an ordinary evening. It was the kind of event that made people feel, simply by walking through the door, that they had arrived. That they had made it. That they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Which, of course, was exactly the feeling Victoria designed it to produce. The guests began arriving at 7:30. Senators. CEOs. Tech founders. Fashion icons. Old money and new money, rubbing shoulders under the same chandeliers, all playing the same careful game of making wealth look effortless. Victoria moved through the room like a woman born to it. Navy gown. Hair swept up. A single strand of pearls at her throat understated by design, which was itself a kind of power move. She smiled. She air-kissed. She discussed quarterly projections and vacation homes with equal fluency. But underneath the surface, she was keeping one eye on the door. Waiting. Charles found her near the champagne table at 8 o'clock exactly. He leaned in with the grin of a man who has been looking forward to something all day. Has our special guest made his entrance yet? Victoria shook her head slightly, still smiling at someone across the room. Not yet. But he'll come. Diane appeared at her left shoulder, dropping her voice low. Do you honestly think he'll show? He might have felt too out of place even to try. Victoria took a slow sip of champagne. Samuel does what he says he'll do. He always has. And there it was again, that small, strange note in her voice that she herself didn't seem to notice. Something that wasn't quite certainty and wasn't quite respect. Something in between. Something she hadn't planned on feeling. The room filled and buzzed and glittered. Glasses touched. Deals were quietly made. Compliments were delivered and received with the practiced ease of people who had been doing this for decades. And at 8:17, something happened that was so quiet, so gradual, that almost no one could say exactly when it began. On the far side of the room, near the east entrance, a cluster of older guests had gone strangely still. Harrison Webb was among them. Harrison Webb, who had spent 30 years on Wall Street moving hundreds of millions of dollars with the calm of a man checking the weather. The man who, legend had it, had once taken a phone call from a senator while in the middle of open heart surgery and still managed to give coherent financial advice before the anesthesia took him under. That Harrison Webb had stopped moving entirely. His wife had touched his arm twice. He hadn't responded. His face had lost its color. And beside him, Patricia Langford, a senior partner at one of the country's largest private equity firms, had stopped mid-sentence in the middle of a conversation that she had clearly forgotten entirely. Her champagne glass was suspended in the air, tilted slightly, as if her hand had simply stopped receiving instructions. Her eyes were fixed on the entrance. Then, like a stone dropped into still water, the silence spread outward. Not all at once. Slowly. Table by table. Conversation by conversation. The laughter softened. The murmurs died. Even the orchestra seemed to drift quieter, though no one had given them a signal. And Victoria, standing near the center of the room, felt the shift pass through the air like a change in temperature. The way you feel a storm before you see it. She turned. And the smile she had been wearing all evening dissolved completely. Samuel Carter had walked through the doors of the Meridian Grand. But it was not the Samuel who climbed out of bed before sunrise and pressed his uniform and opened car doors in the cold morning air. The man standing in the entrance of that ballroom wore a simple black suit. Not flashy. Not overdressed. Just perfectly, precisely tailored. His driver's cap was gone. His hair was neat. His posture was the posture of a man who had stood in rooms exactly like this one many times before, not awed by them, not performing for them, simply present in them. Comfortable. Still. His eyes moved slowly across the room with the unhurried ease of someone who has absolutely nothing to prove to anyone in it. And the people who recognized him, and there were more of them than Victoria had ever imagined there could be, felt the air leave their chests. Because they were not seeing a driver who had arrived at a party above his station. They were seeing a ghost. A man they had known in another life, in another decade, who had vanished without explanation and who was now standing in a ballroom in a perfectly tailored black suit, looking for all the world as though he had never been away. Harrison Webb set down his glass so carefully it made no sound. His voice, when it finally came, was just above a breath. That is Samuel Carter. His wife looked at him sharply. You know him? Harrison did not answer right away. He was still staring across the room. I haven't seen that man in 20 years, he said slowly. I thought he had left the country. I thought, he stopped. Across the room, Patricia Langford had her phone in her hand, thumbs moving fast. Charles Brennan, still standing near Victoria, looked between her face and Samuel's figure with the expression of a man who has just realized that the joke he was telling has a punchline he did not write. Victoria, he said slowly. What do you actually know about this man? Victoria said nothing. Her mouth was dry. Her mind was doing something it almost never did. It was racing. And Samuel Carter walked calmly through the parting crowd, nodding gently at the faces that met his eyes, moving without hurry, without theater, until he stopped just a few feet from where Victoria stood. He looked at her. She looked at him. And for the first time in 3 years, Victoria Hawthorne had absolutely no idea what to say. It was Harrison Webb who crossed the room first. He moved with the deliberate, almost reverent steps of a man walking towards something he had half convinced himself he would never see again. He reached Samuel and extended his hand. Samuel took it, steady, warm, like greeting an old friend on a Sunday afternoon. Samuel Carter, Harrison said, his voice still low, still carrying that quality of disbelief trying to become acceptance. It has been a very long time. Samuel nodded. It has, Harrison. You look well. Harrison let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. We thought you were gone. After the sale, after you stepped away from everything, nobody knew where you had gone. People had theories. Some people said you had moved abroad. Others said you had gotten sick. He paused. A few people said worse things. Samuel smiled gently, the way a man smiles at a storm that passed a long time ago. I'm fine. I have been exactly where I chose to be. By now the circle had formed. Not deliberately, nobody at an event like this deliberately forms a circle around a scene in progress, but organically, the way people move towards something that doesn't yet make sense, drawn by the pull of a story unfolding in real time. Victoria stood at the edge of it. Watching. For once in her life, not at the center of the room. Patricia Langford looked up from her phone. Her voice was level, but her eyes gave her away. Carter Holdings, she said to the woman beside her, reading from whatever she had found. Founded in 1987. Ground freight and logistics, expanded into passenger transportation and fleet services. By the late 90s, operations spanned 14 states. Peak annual revenue was close to $800 million. She paused. The room around her had gone quiet enough that people 3 tables away could hear her. The company was sold in 2004 for just over $1.2 billion. She lowered her phone. And then Samuel Carter disappeared entirely from public life. No interviews. No charity boards. No industry events. No social media. Nothing. It was like he had simply chosen to stop existing. The woman beside her looked across the room at Samuel, who was now calmly accepting a glass of water from a passing waiter. Just water. That's him, she whispered. Patricia nodded. That is him. The number moved through the crowd the way a current moves through water, invisible but felt by everyone it passed through. 1.2 billion. 20 years ago. Before the interest. Before the investments. Before whatever Samuel Carter had been doing in the quiet years since his name had vanished from every publication and every boardroom in the country. The man Victoria had hired to drive her car. The man she had chosen as her entertainment for the evening. The man she had laughed about in the back of a limousine. Victoria felt something she had not felt in a long time. Something she did not have a name ready for because she had not needed the name in so long. She felt small. Not in the physical sense. But in the way that happens when the version of yourself you have been maintaining very carefully suddenly reveals a crack, and through that crack pours the cold air of everything you have been refusing to look at. She thought about the mornings. Hundreds of them. Sliding into the back seat without a glance at the man who had gotten up before sunrise to be there. The phone calls she had conducted at full volume as though the front seat were empty. The conversations with Charles and Diane about people, real people, with lives and histories as though Samuel were part of the vehicle. And she thought about that night in the limousine. About her own voice saying, "Let him see how real wealth lives." The words sat in her chest now like stones. What had she thought wealth was? The orchids? The chandeliers? The room full of people in tailored suits who had the social grace to keep their cruelty private? Samuel turned then. And his eyes found hers with a directness that she was not prepared for. He crossed the room toward her slowly. The crowd moved, not dramatically, not obviously, just slightly, the way people instinctively create space for something they sense is important. He stopped in front of her. And for a long, suspended moment, neither of them spoke. Then Samuel said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "You have a beautiful event, Victoria." She opened her mouth. Nothing came. "I accepted your invitation," he continued, his voice as calm and steady as it had been at every red light in every airport terminal and every early morning for 3 years, "because I wanted to. Not because I was flattered by it. And not because I was intimidated by it." He paused for just a beat. "I have been watching you for 3 years. Not to judge you. But because I once knew a version of myself that looked very much like you. And I wanted to understand whether the person I saw in you was the whole story, or just the armor." Victoria's throat tightened. Samuel's eyes did not waver. "You are brilliant, Victoria. I mean that without any reservation. What you have built is genuinely remarkable. But you have built walls so high around yourself that the people who work beside you every day have stopped being people to you. They have become furniture. Moving parts. Background. And I want you to understand something." He paused. Just for a second. Long enough for the weight of what he was about to say to settle over her before the words arrived. "That is the loneliest kind of rich there is." He let that sit in the silence between them. Then he smiled a real smile, warm and without judgment, and said simply, "Thank you for the invitation. I mean that sincerely." And he turned and walked calmly toward the far end of the bar, pausing to nod at Harrison Webb as he passed, leaving Victoria Hawthorne standing in the center of her own ballroom, in the middle of her own party, with the quiet, devastating feeling that the most important thing said all evening had just been said to her by the man she had employed to drive her car. Later that night, long after the orchestra had packed away their instruments and most of the guests had drifted out into the December cold, Victoria found Samuel sitting alone at a small table near the tall windows that overlooked the city. He had a glass of water in front of him. Not champagne. Not the whiskey that the remaining guests were moving on to. Just water, half full, in a crystal glass that caught the last of the chandelier light. She sat down across from him without asking. He did not seem surprised. Outside the windows, the city was exactly what it always was, lit and restless and indifferent to whatever was happening inside any one building. For a moment, neither spoke. The kind of silence that is not uncomfortable, just heavy. The kind that means something real is about to be said. Then Victoria asked, quietly, "Why did you take the job?" Samuel looked at his glass for a moment. Then he looked at her. "After I sold the company," he said, "I had more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. And I was the most miserable I had ever been in my life." He said it plainly. No performance. No self-pity. Just fact. I had spent 20 years building something. And somewhere inside those 20 years, I couldn't tell you exactly when, I had stopped being a person and started being a position. I looked at the people around me the way you look at them. As assets or liabilities. As useful or not useful. As things that moved in my direction or things that needed to be removed from the path. He paused. And one morning I woke up in a house worth $4 million on a street in Connecticut, and I lay there trying to think of one person, one single person, who I genuinely trusted. Who knew me? Who I had let know me. His voice did not break. It did not need to. The weight of what he was saying was entirely in the words themselves. I could not think of one. He picked up the water glass, turned it slightly in his hand, set it back down. So I left. I liquidated. I made arrangements. And I gave myself a completely different life. I worked as a janitor in a hospital in Philadelphia for a year. I worked a grocery stock shift at a supermarket in Baltimore. I drove freight for 6 months. And then I became a driver. He looked at Victoria. I wanted to know what it felt like to be the person that people look through. To understand it from the inside, not from behind glass. And I wanted to study the people doing the looking. To understand what happens to a person really happens, underneath all the success and the confidence, when they stop seeing the human beings around them. Victoria held his gaze. Her voice was quieter than he had ever heard it, even in 3 years of mornings. And what did you find? Samuel thought about this carefully, the way he did everything. I found that most of them were not cruel, he said. Not at heart. They were not bad people. They were distracted people. So consumed with maintaining the image of success, so busy protecting the story they were telling about themselves, that the world just outside the frame had gone completely blurry to them. The people serving their food. The people cleaning their offices. The people driving their cars. Just blurry. He was quiet for a moment. The cleaning crew was moving through the far end of the ballroom now, working quietly and methodically among the abandoned centerpieces and the half-empty glasses. Samuel watched them. But I also found something else. The people who had the deepest kind of wealth, not the loudest, not the richest on paper, but the ones with the most genuine peace, they were always the ones who knew every name. The maintenance crew. The front desk staff. The driver. He looked at Victoria again. Because they understood something the others had forgotten. That the people everyone else looks through are watching everything. They remember everything. And the truth about who you really are is far more visible from a front seat than from a penthouse. Victoria looked out the window. Below, on the street 20 floors down, a man in a reflective vest was clearing the last of the evening's valet cones from the curb. She watched him for a moment. Really watched him. The deliberate, unhurried way he moved. The small efficiency of each gesture. She had walked past 100 versions of that man 1,000 times. She realized, sitting there at that small table with a glass of water between them and the city glittering below, that she had never once actually seen one of them. Not one. Not in 20 years of walking through lobbies and out of cars and across marble floors. She had been inside her own reflection for so long that the world outside it had simply ceased to register. I saw you, Samuel said, as if he had read her thoughts. That evening on Fifth Avenue. The veteran on the corner. Victoria's eyes came back to him. He was watching her steadily. You didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. You just did it. And then you looked away, like you were almost embarrassed by it. He let that settle. That is not the behavior of a person without a heart, Victoria. That is the behavior of a person who still has one but is afraid to let it show. A long silence. Outside, the city hummed on. Victoria pressed her lips together and looked down at the table. And for the first time in the conversation, something moved across her face that was not composure. Something that had been held behind the composure for a very long time. I didn't know your name, she said quietly. For 3 years. I didn't even know your full name. Samuel nodded slowly. I know, he said. And the way he said it, not with anger, not with blame, just with the simple acknowledgement of something true, was somehow the most devastating thing he had said all evening. In the weeks that followed the Hawthorne Winter Gala, something began to change in Victoria. Slowly. Without announcement. Real change never announces itself. It doesn't arrive with a speech or a public declaration. It arrives the way a season changes, gradually and then all at once, and then you look back and realize you cannot point to the exact day it happened. She started learning names. The security guard who worked the overnight shift in her midtown tower, Marcus. The woman who managed the reception desk on the 14th floor of her Chicago hotel, Donna. The man who restocked the coffee station outside her executive suite every morning at 8:15, his name was Pete, he had 3 kids, and he was putting the oldest through community college on a part-time schedule. She started saying good morning first. She started noticing the small things, the tired eyes of someone working a double shift, the quiet pride in the way a maintenance worker did his job. She started, slowly and imperfectly, to see the world outside her reflection. 6 months after the gala, she overhauled the employee welfare structure across her entire portfolio of companies. Wage increases. Paid family leave. An emergency hardship fund for staff facing sudden crises. She didn't hold a press conference about it. She didn't send it to the media. She just did it. Charles Brennan told her she had lost her edge. Diane Weston suggested, in a roundabout way that she clearly thought was subtle, that Victoria might want to speak to someone. Robert Hale said nothing at all, because Robert Hale, for all his faults, was observant enough to recognize when someone was becoming a better version of themselves, and wise enough to understand that calling it weakness would say far more about him than about her. And Samuel Carter stayed on as her driver for another 8 months. Not because he needed the income. Not because he had nowhere else to be. But because he had seen something begin in Victoria's eyes at that small table near the window, and he was, in the way of a man who has seen and survived a great deal of life, curious enough to watch it grow. Then, one ordinary Tuesday morning in August, he arrived at 7:15 for the last time. He opened her door. She slid in. He closed it. But before he pulled into traffic, he turned in his seat and looked at her directly, which he had almost never done in 3 years. He said, I'm retiring at the end of this week, Victoria. I wanted you to hear it from me before I submitted the paperwork. Victoria nodded. She looked at him steadily. Then she said, Samuel. I owe you a conversation I should have had 3 years ago. I'm sorry I never asked. He held her gaze for a moment. Then gave a small, genuine nod. You asked now, he said. And he turned back to the road. And that was that. He submitted the paperwork on Thursday. On Friday morning he did not come. Victoria sat in the back of a different car driven by a different man and looked out at the city she owned and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the most important education of her professional life had been delivered to her in the front seat of a car by a man she had treated like furniture. And that the most extraordinary thing about it was not what Samuel Carter had once been. It was who he had chosen to become. A man who had owned a billion-dollar company and walked away from it to live simply and honestly and to see the world clearly. A man who, when given the chance to humiliate someone who had humiliated him, chose instead to speak the truth with kindness. A man who, in a ballroom full of people reaching for power and prestige and the approval of their peers, had been the only person in the room who didn't need anything from anyone. And who had chosen, in the end, to try to give Victoria Hawthorne the one thing her money had never been able to buy her. A mirror. A real one. The kind that shows you not what you want to see but what is actually there. Samuel moved to a house on the coast of Maine that fall. Small and quiet, a short walk from the water. He grew tomatoes in a garden he built himself. He read in the afternoons. He wrote letters, actual handwritten letters, to old friends from both of his very different lives. He was not famous. He was not listed anywhere. He was not a story anyone was telling. He was just a man, living quietly, at peace with himself in the specific and irreplaceable way that only comes to people who have decided, finally and completely, to stop pretending to be anything other than what they are. And Victoria? Victoria talked about that night for the rest of her career. Not from stages. Not in interviews. But in private. In quiet rooms, with people she had begun to actually trust, when the conversation turned to the kind of person you want to be measured against the kind of person you have actually been. She would tell the story of the driver. The invitation. The silence in the ballroom. The words at the table near the window. And she always ended it the same way. Not with the shock of Samuel's net worth. Not with the gasp that went through the crowd when his name was recognized. But with the image that had stayed with her longest. A man sitting quietly at a small table near a tall window. A glass of water in front of him. A room full of billionaires behind him. And the most complete, undisturbed peace on his face that she had ever seen on a human being in her life. Because that, Victoria had come to understand, was what real wealth looked like. Not the buildings. Not the portfolio. Not the legacy or the legend or the line on the Forbes list. The peace of a man who knows exactly who he is. Who has nothing to hide. Nothing to prove. And who is, in every room he enters, entirely and completely himself. Now I want to sit with you for a moment. Because this story, as extraordinary as it is on the surface, is not really about Samuel's identity. It is not really about the money. It is about something far simpler and far harder than money. Think about what Samuel actually chose to do. He had every reason in the world to be bitter. He had been overlooked and talked around and treated as invisible by someone he had served with absolute faithfulness for 3 years. He had heard the laughter in that limousine. He knew exactly what the invitation was. He could have walked into that ballroom and made Victoria's humiliation the event of the decade. He had the platform, the credibility, the history, and the audience to do it. And he chose not to. He chose to speak quietly and privately and honestly. He chose to offer a mirror instead of a weapon. And that one decision, that single act of deliberate, considered grace is what made Samuel Carter the most powerful person in that ballroom. Not his bank account. Not his history. His character. The thing no one can take from you and no bankruptcy can erase and no amount of arrogance in a limousine can diminish. His character. So here is what I want to ask you. And I want you to really sit with this before you move on. If you were Victoria, standing in that ballroom, watching a room full of people you had spent years trying to impress suddenly look past you toward your driver, what would you have felt in that moment? Not what would you have said. What would you have felt? That slow, cold wave of realization. The version of yourself you have maintained so carefully cracking open, just slightly, and the cold air of truth rushing in. How long do you think it takes to recover from a moment like that? And would you? Or would you spend the drive home finding ways to reframe the story so that you were still the reasonable one? Because if we are being honest, truly honest, most of us would be tempted. Most of us would want to protect the version of ourselves we have spent years building. And how about this, have you ever treated someone the way Victoria treated Samuel? Not necessarily with a cruel invitation. But with the quiet, daily habit of looking through someone. Of never learning their name. Of treating the people who serve you as though they are part of the background rather than part of the story? Because most of us have. Most of us have moved through the world too quickly, too focused on our own destinations, to notice the people right beside us. And this story is a reminder, a quiet, powerful, lasting reminder, that those people are watching. And they remember. And one day, in ways you cannot predict, the person you decided was invisible will become the most visible person in the room. And if you were Samuel, patient and steady in that front seat, year after year, knowing what you knew, watching what you watched, could you have held your tongue the way he held his? Could you have stayed that kind? That calm? That free of bitterness? Most of us would have cracked. Would have dropped a hint. Would have let something slip, just enough to feel seen, just enough to remind someone of our worth. Samuel waited 3 years. And when the moment came, he did not use it to destroy. He used it to illuminate. There is something in that, something most of us spend an entire lifetime reaching for and never quite holding, and that something is this, the unshakable security of a person who knows their own worth and does not need a single other human being to confirm it. Now tell us in the comments, what part of this story hit you hardest? Was it the laughter in the limousine? Was it the silence that fell over the ballroom? Was it the words Samuel spoke at the table by the window? Or was it the image of the most quietly wealthy man in the room, sitting alone, with nothing in front of him but a glass of water, needing absolutely nothing from anyone? Tell us. We read every single comment. And if this story made you see someone differently tonight, a driver, a janitor, a coworker, a neighbor, please share it. Because that is why we are here. Not just to entertain, but to remind each other of the things we already know but sometimes forget to live. That dignity is not something you earn with a bank balance. That respect is not something reserved for people with titles. And that sometimes, more often than we realize, the person we have been looking through is the person we should have been listening to all along. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the next story is coming. And I promise you, it is absolutely worth staying for.